Hi everyone, and welcome to the Counselling Coaches Book Club YouTube channel. Today we're talking to Brian Back regarding his 2021 book, The Answer to Life, which happens to be one of my favourite books. So no additional pressure, Brian.
Yeah.
Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a counselling lecturer and a counsellor. When I wrote the book, I was also a sociology lecturer. Um, yeah, so I live in England, in the middle of lovely Gloucestershire, uh, with my partner and her two children, um, and currently work as a counselling lecturer and counsellor, and and at times, obviously, a writer, although not currently with a new book in process, but who knows what might come out of this interview.
Who knows what the future holds? Oh, so you're not a million miles away from me because I'm in Oxfordshire. So
All right,
yeah.
okay. No, I didn't know.
Oh, there we go. So talking about the book then, Brian, what led you to write it?
Well, I had started to do my counselling training whilst I was a sociology lecturer, and I started to apply what I was learning in the training into my work as a lecturer, particularly when I was working with adult students, mature students on access courses who always come with a lot of life issues. It's so often the case they're coming from a difficult background, they're coming from, a stressful life, very often solo parents, and they're trying to work and try and look after kids, and they're trying to like create a better life for themselves and coming with a lot of kind of baggage around not feeling very good about themselves, and so the fact that they get on the course and then do as well as they do is really amazing and inspiring, but it's always such a journey for them. And so when I was working with them and I was their personal tutor, very often it meant I was kind of like informally their counselor. And so it was a lot to kind of deal with. And it increasingly became, more and more apparent to me that what was getting in the way of them sometimes being able to do as well as they could wasn't their academic ability, their intellectual ability. It was just all of the stuff that they were bringing with them, And so I really started to think that I could do with, a little bit of training to be able to, help with that. And then so I started training to be a counselor and started to bring those lessons into my lessons, basically, and into all of my lessons. And the impact of it was just mind-blowing. So in particular with the other students who I was teaching, A-level students, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, it completely changed how I worked with them because I used to really struggle to get on with them. Very often, like they'd be talking, they wouldn't be paying attention, they'd be like talking to each other, messing about, they'd be on their phones all the time, and it used to get me like quite annoyed. I was like, I was being ways I didn't really want to be,
Yeah.
you know. But then, like, once I learned to be a counselor and more importantly, learned Carl Rogers' way of doing counseling, which is all about those core conditions about creating a good relationship. And so I started to just work on the relationship with all of my students. So instead of focusing on teaching, just focusing on creating a good relationship with all of my students. And it was absolutely incredible what happened. And it became so successful, I ended up doing much less teaching. So in every class, like in a 2-hour class, I changed it around completely. So I would only teach for about 15 minutes and I would just introduce the subject and then I'd say, and now it's up to you how you decide to learn it, what resource you come to use to create it, and then what you use to revise and learn from. And I'm just going to leave it up to you. And then I'd spend the rest of the class just go around talking to them and connecting with them. And our results went from below average, which is pretty standard in a really poor, deprived area where I was working, that always leads to much worse results. And we went into the top 10% of the UK's educational performance tables through focusing on the relationship with them rather than the teaching. So this is like a miracle. It was just amazing. This turnaround in everyone. Suddenly, like I'm getting on a lot better with my students. They're really enjoying it. I'm much less absenteeism, like results are going through the roof. Everyone's doing better than predicted. And I was like, and this is supposed to be just counseling stuff, isn't it? But then realizing that the lessons we learn as counselors really apply not just to counselling, not just actually in education, but to all of life. And it was when I started to realize that, I started to think like, wow, I'm learning something really profound here. And then I don't know about you, but when I started in my counseling training, like we started off by doing the three main big perspectives.
Mhm.
So we did person-centered
Yeah.
perspective. I'm sure you did the same. You did psychodynamic
Yeah.
perspective and
Yeah,
CBT.
absolutely. Exactly what we did. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it started to become more and more clear to me that actually, even though they seemed in so many ways and we were encouraged to see them as completely different, I just kept seeing, but that's the same. That's the same. And then I started to see the same thing like in philosophy and sociology, and it was just like, it's the same thing. It's the same thing. And I just kept seeing that over and over. And I've always read a lot, you know, like when I went to university as a mature student. So I studied sociology and political theory and political science. And at the same time, I was also already reading psychology and self-help books and things like that. And just started to see this crossover in everything that I was reading, but also then starting to see it in real life as well. And I just couldn't ignore it anymore. And so I started to get really excited. And so I started to focus my reading with a vague idea that I wasn't letting myself admit to, that maybe I might write something.
Hmm.
But I started reading and reading and reading and reading and putting together ideas and starting to make notes, thinking about maybe I think I might maybe write a book. And I've done a bit of writing before around political issues. And so I had a feeling that maybe I might be able to write. So reading and reading and reading. And then one day I think to myself, oh, I've got a day off. What should I do? I know I'll go into town and I'm going to buy myself a book, see what else I can buy, a bit more inspiration. And I went into Waterstones and I looked and looked and looked and I couldn't find anything I wanted to buy. And I realized what was going on was I was looking for my book and it
Yes.
wasn't there.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I just realized then I've got to write it. Because it's not there, and I really felt like there's something really important and true here. And I think maybe that's why everyone writes, isn't it? Because they just think, I've got something important to say that I can't hear anyone else saying.
Yes. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, at least I think that's the purest motive for writing. Absolutely. Yeah,
Mm,
it's interesting though because you speak about philosophy, and I use a lot of philosophy in my work, and you speak about Nietzsche, don't you, in your book? And there is a lot of concepts in philosophy that work very well within therapeutic counselling. I believe,
mm.
but actually they're not really touched on in training very much. So I kind of well, not in my training they were. So I kind of came to that after it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one of the big concepts in there that to me, I totally agree is true for therapy, but true for life, is the idea of the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And that was one of the things that really tied everything together in the book for me, that the purpose of our life is there written in all the stories ever told.
Well, it's every film, every book ever written. It's the hero's journey, isn't it? It's the journey of self-actualization.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And so that, exactly as you said, so that perfectly then twins the ideas of Carl Jung with the ideas of, well, almost everyone in the world, but in terms of counseling, with Carl Rogers. And seeing that matchup was just like, when you can see it coming from all these different angles, now you know it's the truth. If they're saying it in philosophy and they're saying it in psychology and they're saying it in sociology and in literature and in religion, that's the truth.
Yeah.
And for me, when I get something like that, it just becomes so inspiring and compelling. Like, I got to tell people about this, you know?
Yeah, I do, and I think that's like I said, and genuine. I'm not just saying it because I'm the one interviewing you. Your book is one of my favorite books. I have a few, I will admit, but yours is on that shelf, and it's actually one that I recommend to clients as well because I think you don't overcomplicate the subject.
Mm. I think that was always my idea. When I initially wrote it, I came out with it was like almost 80,000 words. And I was like, oh God, no. Because what I'd always felt I wanted to write was a book for everyone.
Yes.
I really wanted to write a book for everyone. Like when I'm teaching, I teach only at level 2 and level 3, which is like GCSE level equivalent and A level. And I always think they're best levels to teach at, because it's sufficiently complicated for it to be able to deal with the big issues, but not so complicated and complex that it gets bogged down in the details and puts people off. So I think you can tell the big stories, you can talk about the big ideas, and I wanted to pitch it at that so that everyone can read it and get it, and hopefully everyone gets something from it.
Yeah. And you're very honest and open about your own life at the very start of the book. How did that feel for you writing that?
I think it felt sort of necessary. Like a really, really good friend of mine was talking about books he'd read, and he was like, there's a lot of books that I kind of like agree with to some extent, but I can't really go with them because you just get this feeling of like they're upper middle class, really well to do. They've actually never struggled. So how can I really go with and believe in what you've got to say? Because I don't think you've been through it. And it just really became clear to me, you've got to show that you've paid your dues. You've got to say, I've been there too. And I know, I don't know about you, but when working with clients in therapy, I really feel an important tool is self-disclosure. Not my whole life.
Oh no, I do massively, and I do. I've had this conversation with several other therapists and actually in book club interviews as well. So I was a clinical hypnotherapist before I was a psychotherapist,
Oh, wow.
and there's a gentleman called Milton Erickson. Milton Erickson was kind of the father of Ericksonian hypnosis. And he worked a lot on stories about himself and how he would tell stories from his own childhood. And I've always used that in my counselling as well, because it's like, actually, if you can show you relate to somebody on a level that is not just theoretical, it actually it aids in that bond.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it really aids in a bond, and it gives them permission to say, like, oh yeah, I do feel anxious. So 'cause I often would say something like that. Oh, well, when I get that feeling of anxiety, when I feel overcome by all of that, and it feels like it makes it then okay for them to say anything. And I think that's particularly true for men. So I found it particularly with men, if I can say, times when I felt depressed, times when I felt anxious. And then it just normalizes it. And like now we're just two people talking and we can be on the same level and just really connecting as humans, as people.
And it is, I think, actually, it's really interesting because you say about that. One of the projects I'm looking at the moment is a men's mental health kind of community thing that I'm looking at. And as much as the support is out there, men do find it harder to go to therapy. I remember many years ago working with a client who came to therapy and really just wanted another man to hear what he was struggling with. And it's like, is that? And I always remember the question: is that normal for a man? Yes.
Mm,
The answer to that is yes. Everything
yeah,
you're experiencing is perfectly normal.
yeah. And I mean, and thinking about that, like I remember talking to a bunch of friends of mine, uh, and saying to all of them, so I wonder, and all guys, so I wonder if you were struggling, would you have therapy? No.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
So
I mean that's I grew up in that kind of that kind of big boys don't cry kind of thing. Yeah, and actually it is quite relevant now. And even just before we came on to do this interview, I was actually reading. I don't know if you're into your cricket, but I was reading about Graham Thorpe, who unfortunately took his own life. Well,
okay.
Graham Thorpe was one of my heroes growing up. So it's actually, and he's an incredibly successful individual, family, children, wonderful career, and took his own life. So it just shows that everybody struggles.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think in terms of what you were just previously mentioning about like starting a men's group, it feels particularly so with men. I don't know, maybe it's just as much so with women, but in relation to what we were saying, it's men when men feel completely alone. And when people are at their most like depressed and at their wits' end, and that's when people are least likely to reach out, least likely to ask for help. And it's so often it's that feeling of being completely alone in that, isn't it?
It
So
is. Well,
what?
it is, and also I think men still feel people, but we're talking about men specifically, struggle with that, looking vulnerable, looking weak. You know,
Yeah,
and I've spoken to many clients, and you can hear the way I talk now. I come from a very working class background, and when I speak to a client on the phone or somebody, I say, "Yeah, that's fine, mate," and they're like, "Oh, just the way you talk is normal." It's like, well, how do you think I'm going to talk?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting. It feels like there's a whole other tangent we can go on there, isn't it? But
Probably is.
yeah, in
Absolutely.
amount of times I've been really glad to have come from a working class background to be able to then let myself freely go back to that, in how I might talk, to be able to connect, and again, just to normalize, isn't it? It feels
Well,
so
it
important.
is normalizing, isn't it? And I think there's a part in going back to your book where you touch on about, you know, I'm not going to remember the percentages here. You might be able to remind me, but the people that go through public education to be put into those roles where they're meant to make a difference, and that so few people are given that opportunity, whereas the rest of us are just left sometimes to struggle.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, oh, such an enormous other topic there, isn't it? But I mean, in terms of like, yeah, the lack of opportunity, but most of all, the lack of opportunity to even feel that you could,
Yes.
that you're good enough to, rather than, as so many people in private education get taught right from the start, you're born for this, it's your place, it's your position in the world that you're bound to take up. You are kind of born to rule, whereas so many people, we never have that sense of I'm good enough.
No,
You
and
know,
that's so true, isn't it? I mean, I remember that sense when I was at school through, I left school at 15, went back to college and then university as an adult, as a mature student. But I always remember actually sitting with a teacher who I won't name, and he was a wonderful teacher actually. And I wanted to be an archaeologist, believe it or not, when I was at school. And I
Mm,
always remember that teacher saying, "Oh, I'm not sure you can do that." And I was like, well, that was actually more of a product of where I grew up and the era that I grew up in, more than actually my limitations.
mm. But
But
what
it's so true, isn't it?
yeah, perfect example of not being made to feel that you're someone and you can do, as much as anyone else. And I think that was, another big part of what drove me to write the book, to try and provide evidence that maybe gave people some reason to feel like they can be someone.
Yes.
And I don't mean someone in terms of like being rich and famous, but they can be someone in their own eyes.
Yeah, well, and that's all yeah, I mean, that whole rich, famous kind of celebrity culture, that's the term I'm looking for nowadays,
Yeah.
is very much, in my opinion, almost like a false idol. It's like, look at that, we put these people up there, but actually, one, they're just normal people themselves and often struggle because of the position they're put in by the media. But
Mm.
two, not that isn't that's their choice to do that in life. You can choose to do whatever you want as long as you're fulfilled by it. That's the purpose.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And when you think, and I know from my own experience as a professional singer, a lot of people in the entertainment world, as in the world of politics, we were just talking about, it's so often the case that people are in those roles because they're looking for external validation because they're empty inside, when really what we need to be aiming for is giving people a way to feel full inside, to feel enough. And so much again of what my book was about that success isn't about outward success. It's about you knowing that you are a good person and finding, through my book, hopefully some way to prove that to yourself. And then in proving to yourself that you're a good person, you're making life better for you and for everyone else around you. And if
Actually, and I don't think I got this from your book. I think I've done this for years, but I don't think. But it's one of the things I when I'm working with somebody and they're really struggling. Let's say with it's depression. Let's say use depression as an example here. I will say about building that relationship with somebody. So I'll say the next time you go into the shop, smile at the cashier. Smile, just smile at them and see what happens.
Mm,
Just see if you can form some kind of bond there. Yeah, because
yeah,
it changes things. They will smile back.
yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, if you just put your mind to it and then observe how often that very thing happens.
Yeah.
And it's there for us all of the time. There's connection waiting for us, even if it's just a little bit in a little quick chat, while you're loading up your shopping. But there's connection available to us all of the time, and it's always connection that heals.
Yeah,
You know.
it's so true. And unfortunately, I think, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, in the world we live in today, we're almost failing with those connections. COVID changed things, lockdown changed things.
Yeah.
People realized that we needed that connection then. But with social media and such like, actually, people don't put as much effort into the human connection, the genuine human connection. I mean, person to person.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting. I just finished reading, should have read it long ago, but just finished reading Oprah Winfrey's book that she did with Bruce Perry or Parry. Oh, it's terrible. I feel awful to him that I keep forgetting his name, but it's called What Happened to You. And he does a brilliant job of just talking about over and over the importance of connection and his formula for when dealing with people who are really, really aroused. And so this works for when we're in, a situation with our children or our partners or our colleagues, whatever it might be. And the 3 R's, he calls it. So regulate, relate, reasons. So first you just got to regulate the body, then you've got to build connection, and then from that place finally we might be able to connect intellectually. But it's all about the connection, always all about the connection. And the whole book gives us again reasons why it's about that connection. And as you said, it just feels like more and more modern day life is pulling us apart from genuine connection and genuine sources of community and connection.
So coming back to the book, what was it like writing it for you then? Because like you said, you had that moment where you were like, oh, I'm looking for my book and it doesn't exist. So now I've got to actually write it.
Well, actually, I mean, the writing process, and it started off being a real struggle. The preparation process was fine. I was really lucky when I did an access course. So that's that course to prepare you for university.
Yeah.
I had like a great English literature lecturer named Maya, and she gave me this great method for preparing to write essays, and so I just used that writ large.
Oh, okay.
And it's what I always teach all of my students. So I just did that. I did the same process of note taking and note organizing. So I had all my notes there, but it was just the writing up process. Initially, it was so painful. My process was something like sit down, write one sentence, and then walk around the living room for like an hour and a half, and then maybe come back and write another
That
sentence.
sounds like my essay writing process.
But an amazing process I came upon. I remembered a book that someone had reminded me of long, long ago, and then I was reminded of it myself, a book called The Artist's Way.
Okay.
And there's this great exercise in it. It's the first thing that she gets you to do, and it's called Morning Pages. And I've recommended this to so many people, the book and the exercise. And all it is first thing in the morning you come, you sit down, and you write 3 pages freehand of just like whatever's there. You just brain dump whatever's there, not trying at all to make it legible. Doesn't have to make sense, no punctuation, no anything at all. Just get it down. And I found that what I did every day, I got it down. Inevitably, what was coming out was, I want to write about this today. I want to write about this today. I want to write about this today. And once I started doing that, I would just sit down, and I would write. And suddenly I was powering through it. And then, as I said at the beginning of our chat, suddenly I had 80,000 words in front of me. And yeah, and so that was great that I got it all out. But then what was really painful was the editing, because I got it down to around 30,000. So I got it down to be the little accessible book that nobody would think, oh God, I can't read that. I got it to that size,
Actually, it's interesting because that's why I recommend it to people, because it's not overwhelming. There's a lot of things that I would like people to read, but I know if I ask them to go and buy it, or if I lend them my copy, they're going to take one look at it and go, I'm not reading that.
Yeah. And so that was really kind of very much in my mind. I wanted that, but that editing process it really hurt. And I got professional editors, and that's just like paying to be beaten. That's what that's like, because when you write, and particularly this book was so personal and it had so much of me in it. And then when they're saying, no, not that, cut that, don't like that, that's no good. It was just like another punch in the stomach and another punch in the stomach. It was really, really, really hard. But, in terms of I think an inevitable question is, what would I say to anyone who's thinking about writing? It's just that it's one of the hardest things. I think, yeah, it's the hardest thing I've ever attempted as a standalone task, but it's just so incredibly worthwhile. You know, I never ended up doing a PhD, but I often thought about it. And one of the reasons that I often thought about it was whenever I spoke to someone who had a PhD, they were just so coherent in their thought and in their communication. They'd really put the work into tying all their ideas together and to be able to just communicate them and say, this. And it was always enjoyable to talk to them. And this was like an informal PhD in so many ways, you know, because I did so much reading around it and then really had to filter through all of my ideas, write them down, order them, organize them, you know, throw them out, put them all together. So I went through a similar process. So I know for me, it was just a brilliant process for me and a sense of who I was and what I was capable of. Because having done that, I felt a lot more like, yeah, I could do that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could do that. Why not? I've done that.
And you're still definitely young enough to do a PhD as well.
Well, maybe, but I kind of feel less of a need to, and less of a sense of what would I do with it, you know?
Yes. Yeah.
Um, because I don't think I currently have any burning idea that I want to research,
So,
you know. So, and I think kind of like coming back to, you know, what you would say to someone who's thinking about writing, is that to me it came down to I had to write this. Because for me it was just like I'd seen like the truth,
mm.
you know, obviously with a, you know, with a title like that, you know.
But it's a very bold title. I always remember that when I first bought it. I was like, the answer's to life. Well, it's not. It's not going in half cocked. It's confident.
Yeah, well, I mean, because it all came from like an old friend of mine who was just the most inspiring person I've ever met, and the book came because of one thing he said, but also the entire way is his entire way of being. My old friend Michael, um, who was just such a, it was just healing to be with him, you know. And I met him at a time when I was really broken and my dad had just died. And yeah, I got through it in such large part thanks to him. And it was him. He gave me the title. He didn't say like, one day if you want to write a book, here's a title for it. But he just said like, one day, Brian, the answer to life is, and I'm not going to say what it is because I like to think people will hang on to read to the end when in the last chapter I say what it is, when I bring it all together.
Okay, and I won't spoil it then. But what I will say is, I think. Well, what do you think? I think people already have the answer. I think they just don't realize they have it.
That's exactly what I think. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so for me, a big part of the reason why I wrote the book and wrote it the way I did was I wanted to provide compelling evidence so that what people have some sense of, some feeling of, but don't feel that they can actually say with absolute certainty, it's this. I wanted to be able to give them ammunition, give them evidence so that they would know. And so that then they could go from now on, I'm going to live my life by what I already know with absolute certainty.
And you know what? It's really interesting you say that. So, like I said, I think I bought this earlier this year. I can't remember exactly when. Like I said, I read an awful lot of stuff, and it's not a massive book, so I probably read it in one sitting, if I'm perfectly honest. And I skimmed back through it this morning, actually, before we came on today. Um, I remember when I first read it. Bearing in mind I've been doing this a long time now. And there was a part of it, and I can't remember what part it is. I probably highlighted it. I'm one somebody that highlights and scribbles in books a lot of the time. But I remember reading it thinking, oh yeah, I am right. Even if you get your confidence knocked, I'm not wrong. You know, there's a part in there and I remember, I still remember that thought now.
Mm. Oh, yeah, I am right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think that's what I'm wanting people to feel. Do people feel bolstered? Like, yes, this is the way to live. Like this is the way, a way, as Carl Rogers say, a way of being. It's a way of being, and it's the only way of being. And hopefully, in my book, I've provided enough evidence to make people really believe, yeah, this is, with all that evidence, obviously the only way of being that makes sense in the world. You know.
So I have and again, like I said, this is a question off script, by the way. So if you don't want to answer it, please don't feel you have to. But I'm sure you, as I and anybody that tries to live their life with those core beliefs in place, has probably come across opposition, quite difficult opposition sometimes. How do
Yeah.
you personally handle that? Because I know I've come across it, and sometimes I've always tried to be calm. I've always tried to be. I hear what you're saying, and I accept what you're saying. It just doesn't line up with my values. But
Mm.
what do you do in that circuit?
Well, I had I had like friends of mine say, so what you're saying is that, and I was like, well, when we just say it that way, it sounds like quite simplified, but you know, even though it might seem like simple, like an over simple, like that if you focus your way of being on connection, on being good to people, well, it feels like, well, yeah, there's lots of evidence for like people being like naturally bad, and so we can't, because one of the claims I make in the book is that we are essentially good.
Good.
And even like the worst of us, when given the chance, when given the right conditions, will start to show that. There's an example I have that I didn't put in the book, but I think it's one of the greatest examples. A guy called Jimmy Boyle, who was once known as the most dangerous man, the most violent man in Scotland. You can look him up. There was a film made of his life story, of his book that he wrote, which was called A Cry Freedom or A Cry for Freedom. I can't remember which, but he was locked up in prison for murder, and he was considered just like the most disgusting, horrible human being you could imagine. So, for example, whilst in prison, he was regularly, beating up, mauling, guards who were coming in en masse in big gangs of 12 to beat him up. And all he knew was fighting. So one day, what he did one day, he defecated and he covered himself in it and all the walls and himself in it. And because he knew he was going to get beat to crap. And so he said, right, if you want to come in and touch me, you're going to get this too. That's just how desperate and degraded he was. But then towards the end of his time in prison, somebody said, how about if we just treat him nice? As in, we give him a bit of freedom, we give him a bit of autonomy, we give him a chance to just, to just live and be. And it completely transformed him. He was still in prison, but he was treated like a decent human being, quite simply. Treated like a decent human being, and it transformed him, and he ended up coming out, and he devoted his life to looking after other people in disadvantaged situations the way he'd been, that had given him no choice in life. But it was just a perfect example that if you give people the chance, they will finally show that at heart they are good people. That's what we are naturally. We're natural. Yeah, and I think that's so important, and it's been over and over in so many situations in my life, just shown to be totally true. If you come towards people from a place of, I believe you're a good person, I believe you're a good person, and I'm going to treat you that way. And the difference you get than if you come towards them with a sense of distrust, or a sense of, or coming from a place of anger or unhappiness, you can't help talking cliches when you're talking about these things, because as you said, people already know this stuff, so it's part of our culture. There was a song, I can't remember what it's called, but a big line in it was, you get what you give, you only get what you give. And if you come to people from a loving place, then you're going to get the best from them. If you assume that they are the best and treat them as such, you'll get the best from them. But if you assume that they're a piece of shit, then you're going to get shit back.
Yeah, and that's true, isn't it? I suppose the only thing I would say to that is that sometimes people can't help but hurt others because of the trauma that they've been through.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that. I'm not saying that we should go about like innocent and blind to the
No, no,
fact
of
that,
course. Yeah.
there are traumatized, damaged people in the world who will hurt other people. One of the things that I start the book with is that understanding, is that hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
You know, that's something that happens, something that we do, but having that understanding is the basis of, well, how we might get to a better place. Understanding they're not evil, they're damaged.
Yeah.
That people are damaged, they're hurt, and so we need to heal that hurt. But yeah, and I mean, like there was a great film that I saw that Gabor Mate was involved in, you know, about people in prison, and it was called Step Inside the Circle.
Mhm.
And there's all these people in this maximum security prison who were all incarcerated for the worst kind of crimes. And then there was somebody, we did an exercise with them saying something like, so if you came from a family that was like this, so a family that was abusive, where there were people on drugs, where there was violence, all those things, all those kind of adverse childhood experiences, step inside the circle. Every single person in that exercise were all stepping inside the circle. They'd all come from like the worst kind of backgrounds. They were hurt, damaged, traumatized people. And so what else can you expect?
No, no.
And even though, of course, I talk about a lot of theory in my book, and it could be said that, well, what I've come up with is a big, grand, overarching theory, which I do believe is true. At the same time, I'm absolutely with the idea that I think Irvin Yalom says is that with every person we have to construct a new therapy, you know, and I do think that's really, really true. It's always different with every person. Yes, which is why it's so forever engaging and compelling and interesting.
And that is so true, isn't it? Interesting that. So I was looking for a part of your book while you were talking, and I found something else. But so I'm just going to read it to you because I want to know what your thoughts are on this. I don't know if this has changed from when you wrote this to now, but you. So it says that we're all connected to and dependent on every other person in our society, which completely agree with, by the way, for our ever increasing levels of health, wealth, and happiness. Well, health and wealth, I completely agree with, but happiness, I wonder if that's what's your thoughts on that now?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you remember. I know that when I started writing that, before I get to that bit, I wrote and hopefully happiness.
You did, yes. To be fair, you did. In brackets, it does say hopefully. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what?
So,
I want to just discuss that ever so slightly.
yeah, so well, we are all connected to each other, and it's something that is such an essential learning, because it's only when we get that we have some chance of maybe realizing we need to treat everyone better.
Yeah.
That it's not the case that some people are more important than others. Every single person is important. And the more we're able to do that, to treat every single person as important, the more chance we have of increasing just everyone's wealth, not just everyone's health, but also increasing everyone's happiness. Because at the base of so many people's unhappiness is a sense of, I'm not good enough.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And I just wondered how you felt about that, given the current state of the well, we've obviously we're doing this interview in August, aren't we? Sorry, I've tried to look at the date on my screen. So it's August 2024. Obviously, we've just had the riots and everything that happened last week and the weekend before. I wondered, do you think happiness is improving?
I think we've been going through a really difficult time. It doesn't seem to me that our society, whilst governed by the Conservatives, had a focus on everyone's happiness, on everyone's worth.
Yeah.
And I thought that our society got worse and was made worse for a lot of people, and a lot of people's lives became a lot more difficult. They became a lot more happy, so a lot more unhappy, a lot more stressful. And I got to admit that one of the reasons why I wrote the book was partly as a political statement.
Yeah, I wondered that because you don't mention it really in the book, but you just touch on it ever so slightly, and I wondered if that was there was a cause there.
Because what I was trying to do was to show at every stage, in every part of life, the same truth applies. And if it applies at one-to-one in counselling, if it applies in education, if it applies with our family, our friends, and our loved ones, it also applies in society. So it applies in politics. The same applies if we treat every single person like they're worthwhile and construct our society so as to give everyone that chance to feel worthwhile about themselves and to self-actualize. That's how we create a better society. That's how we create a better world. And then we create a better world for everyone individually and for everyone else by treating every single person as important. So everyone gets a chance to feel good about themselves. So they're not hurting, they're not angry, they're not bitter, they're not resentful, they're not acting out and hurting other people. And
So we should really go back to the book. That's why we're here. But actually, to be fair, these are all subjects that are touched on in the book, aren't they? So we've not drifted too far. Although anybody that's ever done an interview with me or had a conversation with me, but will know that I do tend to go off on tangents, Brian. So, any plans for another one?
I don't think so. You know, I think one of the reasons why like I wrote my book is first off to give that evidence, but knowing that, yeah, lots of other people might be saying the same thing, but we all need to find the one book that speaks to us.
Yeah.
You know, and then coming back to like our advice to an author, you know, you might not end up being a best-selling author. I haven't become a best-selling author, but you never know who you're going to touch. You never know what difference you might make to somebody. You probably won't know because people aren't going to read your book and get back to you. You know, I only get a few people come back and say, "Oh, I really got something from your book. Thank you." But you never know. And all of us need that one book that speaks to us when all the others didn't.
Yeah, that's true. Well, for example, you never knew that I'd read it, did you? And so you happened to email me by chance. You didn't know that I'd read your book. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a real shock that I still feel a little bit kind of gobsmacked by. But I've got to say, in relation to that, you know, one of the reasons that I contacted you was because I knew it would be a nice conversation.
Yeah.
You know, having watched some of the other interviews, I just thought this is a nice, personable, interesting guy who is really good to talk with. And I really had a sense of it would be the way it's been. It would be just a really nice conversation. I had no idea it would go along as long as it did, but
I was going to say,
really
we have
easily.
been talking for a long time, haven't we? But actually, no, Brian, I've really enjoyed it. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you. And funnily enough, when you emailed me and I remembered your book, I thought, yeah, I'm probably going to really enjoy this one, and I really have. So thank you ever so much. Thank you ever so much for being
Well,
here.
I just want to say in relation to that, yeah, I was pretty gobsmacked, like, oh my God, you read the book, but I was able to get over that just because of that sense I already had of you of just like, yeah, you know, Tom's a good guy. This is going to be a nice conversation.
I was going to put it in my email back to you. Very interestingly, I thought, should I say I've read your book? And then I thought, no, I won't bother. I'm going to dig it out and then tell you when I see you. But yeah. Well, right now, here's my dog's nudging me, so he's clearly ready to go outside. But Brian, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you. Thank you ever so much for being here.
Yeah, and Tom, I've really appreciate being here. It's been really nice getting to know you. Great conversation. And I got to say, yeah, thank you for reading my book and for buying it and for enjoying it and saying and it's quite kind of, oh God, and you know, it's a bit difficult to suddenly handle all of that, but really nice to hear that you enjoyed it and got so much from it. So thank you. This has been a lovely conversation. I hope we get to talk again, Tom.
Hopefully we will. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
So thanks again. I've really enjoyed this today. And I hope you get now to get outside in the sunshine and have a lovely walk.
Hopefully, yes,
We really want to go out.